Yeah.
Because we have this very high rate of inflation, the Fed usually what they do is they try to raise interest rates to slow down the economy, and that usually brings down the rate of inflation. At least that's the theory, right? The problem that we have right now is we have all this debt. So we have sovereign debt, which is the government, how much they owe all those people that they've issued treasuries to or that have bought the treasuries.
Can you explain to the people how that works, just so they kind of see when they know when they say, oh, well, the government's a debt. I don't think a lot of people understand what they mean by that.
Yeah. So what happens is the revenue, if you look at the government like a business, their revenue is just generated through taxes.
Okay. That's the only way they collect revenue, really.
Right. So if they spend money in addition to what they collect in taxes, they've got to borrow the money to spend it. So the way they borrow money is they issue treasuries. Just like a corporation would issue bonds. They have to borrow the money. So
what's a treasury?
So treasury is just a bond that's issued by the government. So that's the government. Let's say they issue a 10-year treasury and you buy the treasury. They're giving that to you. So it's your asset and it's their liability. They're saying, we're going to pay you a certain amount of interest over the next 10 years. And then we're going to make payments to you, and you agree on that. So you're like, yes, I'll loan the government $1 million or something.
But aren't they the ones giving themselves the bonds? Or
no, they're selling them. So let's say that you're the government. And that you're someone that's buying the treasury. So you would say, okay, Fresh, I need $1 million loan. And then he says, okay, I'll give you the $1 million. So he gives you the $1 million.
And he's a private citizen or a private entity?
Yeah. And you give him an IOU. So that IOU would be a bond. And if the government gives an IOU, we call it a treasury. A lot of those IOUs are short term. So we were talking about a loan for 10 years, but if you lent Fit money for just let's say 6 months, he would have to pay that back in a very short period of time. Whereas if you lent him the money for 30 years at a specified interest rate, then he wouldn't have to worry too much about what interest rates do over the next 6 months, right? So the position the government's in right now is about, let's say 10 or 12 trillion, maybe even more now. Of that 30 trillion, it matures in the next year. So it's very short term in maturity.
Okay.
So what happens?
So the loan term comes to an end.
Right. They have to pay you back.
Okay.
So what happens if interest rates go up, then they don't have the money to pay you back. So they've got to borrow more
money
just to pay the people back.
Yeah.
Now they call it rolling over the debt. And if they do that at a higher interest rate, then that makes the debt burden even harder to handle. So like if you can imagine if you had a mortgage payment for $2,000. And let's say that was at a 3%
small
interest
house,
rate.
but
Let's say it was a 3% interest rate. Well, if interest rates go up to 10%, now all of a sudden your mortgage payment is going to go from $2,000 up to, who knows, let's say $4,000. So that's going to make that debt you owe a much higher burden from your monthly income. And it's the exact same with the government. So my point there is, with the government having these huge debts, it makes it very difficult for the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates. It's the same thing with corporations. Their debt is at all-time highs. And the same thing with consumers. We have consumer debt at all-time highs. So the economy is very, not only fragile, but it's very susceptible to higher interest rates. And so what the Fed is trying to do right now is they're just trying to, it's this balancing act where, yes, we need to bring down the rate of inflation by increasing interest rates, but we can't do it too quickly or else we're going to break something. And if we break something, then that could be far worse than the inflation that we're trying to cure. And so, they did this back in 1981. For those of your viewers who have studied economics at all, they know a guy named Paul Volcker. He was the Fed chair at the time. He was very famous for breaking the back of inflation. The 1970s, inflationary decade. So he came in and he raised interest rates almost up to 19%.
On just like buying things, or on home loans, or what was he raising interest rates?
So that was the overnight rate that the Federal Reserve set. So all interest rates, so basically mortgage rates would be 19% plus whatever. or retail investors.
What I'm getting, George, is that like the government will never be able to pay it back at this rate.
Oh, no chance they can pay it back. But they don't really have to pay it back. They just have to keep it to a level that's serviceable. And so the United States is in a position of having the global reserve currency, which allows us to create a lot more dollars than the domestic economy actually needs. And this is a huge benefit, because if another country created as many dollars as we do out of thin air, their currency would depreciate very, very quickly. And the price of those treasuries would go down, the yield would go up, so it would restrict government spending. So we can get away with a lot more of that government deficit spending than other countries can, right? So you'd have to go borrow $5,000 just to pay your bills, and then there you would owe someone $5,000 that you would have to pay them back at a future date.
Bam. Okay.
So that's the same position the government's in
right now,
except for they owe people $30 trillion. And keep in mind, tax revenue is about maybe $3 trillion a year. So that's a very, very large deficit. My point is, if we didn't have the global reserve currency, they would not be able to run that high of a deficit.
Would be like Venezuela, probably, right?
Well, it more like Argentina.
Okay. Bam. Okay.
So this is why China, their exports to the United States are so important, because we're paying for those exports in dollars. So then they take those dollars and they can use those dollars to buy food, to buy fertilizer, to buy commodities, to buy oil, natural gas.
Oh, so they have to use dollars for food and everything else too. It's not just oil.
Almost all commodities are denominated in dollars.
Oh, I knew oil was, and I knew that's where the petrodollar originates from, but I didn't realize for everything else too. So all the countries.
Yeah, and even and not just commodities, a lot of the stuff that corporations buy from each other, even if it doesn't involve the United States at all, it's going to settle in dollars.
Gotcha.
So that's why the dollar is really two completely separate currencies. It's a domestic currency, and then it's also a global currency.
Okay.
So what happens is, when we print too many dollars in the United States, a lot of times those dollars leave the United States and go into the global system, and they just get sucked up by the global system, because there's so much demand for those dollars because of global economic activity outside the United States. But if we didn't have all that demand for dollars, because they're being used to such a great degree outside the United States, those dollars would continue to circulate in the United States, chasing goods and services, and that would mean the price of the stuff would go up a lot faster than it otherwise would, even though now, the CPI is at 8.2 or 3%. And you guys...
What's CPI stand for?
The Consumer Price Index.
Okay.
So that just means the government's measurement of how fast prices are increasing for the stuff that you guys buy daily. Yeah, but see, where that really hits people is usually the rate of inflation, or the rate that goods and services are increasing in price exceeds the level that wages go up.
Bam.
Okay.
That's key.
So if you look at what we call real wage growth, and that's just the level of incomes or wages adjusted for the rate of inflation, we actually have negative real wage growth. So people's purchasing power, especially with the poor and middle class, is decreasing significantly. And that's one of the problems when the government sends out stimmy checks or PPP. Initially it sounds great. Well, we're helping people because they can't afford X, Y, and Z.
It's temporary.
Yeah, because we're locking them in a cage, basically. So we'll just go ahead and subsidize it with this quote unquote free money. But what they don't realize is that creates this inflationary spiral that we're living in right now. So instead of helping the poor and middle class, after a year or 2 years on net balance, it hurts them.